considered a regrettable though necessary task that is subordinate to the goal of a just and lasting peace. Instead, the act fills the void in military culture left by the absence of a right intention as a guiding principle. And it becomes, you get this confusion of task and purpose maybe occurring. If there is no cultivation of a disposition toward a just peace, then there will be a disposition towards something else. I maintain that a soldier, like any human, right, cannot be dispositionless. I think that's an impossibility, at least when we're talking about humans. So in the worst case then, a disposition forms towards killing for its own sake, involving a kind of dark-hearted relish for it. Now, more often, and maybe marginally better, is a disposition towards a negative peace, the kind that's established by utterly eliminating the enemy. This would be the aim that the ancient historian Tacitus had in mind, right? When he noted that where empires make a desert, they call it peace, that line. I suppose this negative peace might be legitimate in some extreme cases of aggressors who are fanatically committed to the elimination of others. However, soldiers, and again, civilians, should not be disposed to this peace, but only settle for it if those extreme circumstances arise. Their disposition should remain towards a peace involving a reconciliatory coexistence within an international community, a harmony between political bodies based on justice, instead of toward an absence of conflict because only one political body remains standing. Even a softer version of this negative peace, maybe where adversaries are subjugated instead of outright killed, that rarely meets the standards of justice and should therefore be rarely taken up as the peace to aim for. Besides being unjust, such a peace will rarely last. The peace of subdued men, in the words of one scholar, is not a genuine peace, but a peace marked by profound instability. So when soldiers understand this peace only negatively, it becomes just too easy to elevate killing too prominently. Killing can be treated casually, more efficacious than it really is, especially when professional norms promote an application of moral principles with the insufficient depth of a legalistic checklist, the mechanical efficiency of a bureaucracy, the detached indifference of an automaton. Now, this disposition towards a negative peace and its corresponding fixation on killing, it's easier to maintain if enemies are considered less than human. Subhuman adversaries, animals or insects, if they're portrayed as such, right, arguably don't warrant the kind of restraint that one grants to fellow humans, nor the same commitment to a shared future. So besides the social influences of nationalism, racism, or negative cultural stereotypes, the ostensible justice of one's war can also prevent one from seeing the enemy as anything other than a criminal, and as such subject to anything that he has coming to him. This crusading mentality itself is one more pressure to dehumanize enemies, as well as the non-combatants who are often associated with them. Now, instead of a subhuman status of an insect, however, the crusading mentality can cast enemies as morally evil monsters. And notice how killing then can there too become some kind of central moral obligation. You know, no matter what peace it produces, that's not the judge of whether the lethal act is legitimate or not anymore. Now, a killing intention versus a right intention is also easier to maintain, I want to argue, with a militaristic view of war. You know, if war is considered to have intrinsic value, some kind of nobility with no recognition of its tragedy, you know, then the killing it entails is not regretted, but embraced. I think the militaristic stance is often a coping mechanism for soldiers confronted with this tension between some kind of prima facie immorality of killing and yet, you know, the prima facie anyway, a duty to kill. And so instead of working through this tension, you know, which might, if you think about it, propel them to some notion of right intention, the soldier might dismiss the former part of that tension, settle on the latter part of the tension, usually with the help of others in a similar predicament, and due to cultural forces at large, perhaps, And you sometimes then get, as one veteran describes it, in talking of his own experience while deployed, he says, once you learn to push past the immoral behavior, it becomes easier. So I think there's this storm of influences, right, between a killing intention that has taken the place of any notion of a right intention, the dehumanization that all too easily occurs, and then this militarism. These can reinforce each other in a military culture that's not anchored by an explicit disposition to a just and lasting peace. If you'll allow me to have two final points. One is an analogy with surgery, and then one last piece of evidence I want to gesture at. So if you think about surgery for a second, right? I mean, it might help illustrate the danger of distorting the soldier's overarching purpose. I don't think anyone wants to be the patient of a surgeon who's obsessed with surgery, ignoring what would actually contribute to full health. As much as that surgeon's skill with a scalpel matters, right? Her essential purpose remains the promotion of physical well-being. She shouldn't attempt surgery just because she has the authority to do it, the skill to do it, and then just has this relish for it. She should fully understand when and in what way wielding her scalpel will best contribute to that health. She also must be able to adjust to unforeseen details or complications during surgery. So in the same way, I want to suggest soldiers too must expertly wield lethal force, but must also understand the just peace that the killing act is supposed to promote, and understand when lethal force may actually undermine it, and adjust their actions in unexpected circumstances to still bring about the just peace. Let me quote an American general from 1881, John Schofield. He notes, "The object and end in war is not to kill. This is but one of the means necessary to that end. The object of war is to conquer an honorable, advantageous, and lasting peace." But when soldiers have no appreciation of this peace, nor some kind of commitment to it, as is entailed by the principle of right intention, they're dangerously ill-equipped to wield that lethal force wisely. So I'll end by gesturing at evidence of the damage done to soldiers when right intention is not emphasized, and that of moral injury. This burden has received rising attention the last 2 decades among veterans, though there's certainly nothing unique when you really get into it of moral injury that makes it unique to military service. I don't know if everyone's already familiar with moral injury. It shares many symptoms, with PTSD, but in fact, more and more they're highlighting how PTSD is a fear-based phenomenon and moral injury is this guilt-based phenomenon. It can be spurred by the betrayal by a superior or by someone in authority who maybe has gotten you to inadvertently do something immoral. It also, though, can manifest maybe when in fact you realize after the fact that you've done something immoral, and maybe it's portrayed more as a self-betrayal of your own moral code. What actually has many folks interested in the phenomenon, though, is that it seems like that self-condemnation can manifest even when it's hard to observe among the soldiers. Well, you can't point to a clear war crime, or you can't point to maybe actions that are of questionable nature, say actions that their actions did not violate the rules of engagement or the laws of armed conflict. I think what might be going on with these specific soldiers dealing with moral injury, though, is that we see the result of failing to foster a right intention. They're struggling with the motivations that they may have had for certain actions, even if the actions themselves conformed with all the relevant rules. So there's an excerpt of what is a longer argument I offer for right intention as an explicit principle of jus in bello. I appreciate your attention. I certainly look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Kevin. If everybody wants to join me in making the little applause, I don't know, we do like a weird applause reactions now, I guess, on Zoom. But I'll applaud because I thought that was lovely. I have all kinds of questions. But I will defer to everybody else because I could just question you for days about this, Kevin.
Yeah. We'll have to arrange it.
Yeah, we'll have to arrange some
Yeah.
time to chat. I have thoughts.
Right.
All right, so now we're gonna turn to Q&A. So what I'm gonna ask everybody to do is, if you have a question, just type question in the chat, right? So you don't have to type out your whole question. And then I'll call on you and you can unmute. So it looks like our first question is from, and if I mispronounce your name, I apologize profusely in advance. From Stephen DiLorenzo.
Perfect. And Colonel Cutright, it's great to see you. And thanks for aptly discussing all these phenomenons that I've felt in the military and been subject to. I mentioned before that I had a paper that's relevantly similar. I'm ready to share that with you finally now. But my question today is about how do we refine what a right intention is? And so in your talk, you've been talking about an intention to just and lasting peace. I don't know if you meant that specifically to be the one, or what about an intention to defend my co-compatriots? So what I'm pointing to is like, do we have to have an ad bellum intention or an in bello intention? And how will we resolve like a principal resolution to which one I can have? Because both of those plausibly seem like right intentions.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my short answer would be, I mean right intention with capital R and capital I, meaning a notion of right intention that is grounded in the traditional and historical maybe analysis of a singular right intention that's meant in initiating a war. I think that specific intention is part of what a soldier needs to maintain even in the conduct of that war. I think there's actually, as you know, I'm sure your own intuitions maybe would be concerned about too, right? If we let a right intention be merely captured as one of caring for my, what'd you call them, co-patriots, for my battle buddies or my fellow citizens or something like that. I'm not trying to suggest that there's something wrong about it, but I think there is something incomplete about that. And I specifically mean a soldier maintaining an intention towards securing a peace between these peoples that is just and lasting. So I guess I'd want to keep it to that, partly because I think that helps the soldier navigate things in a way that caring for his or her battle buddies, right, never gets him to think about. And let me offer, if I got the time, let me offer one clarification too. I think one easy way that I could go wrong with this, and I don't want to, is suggesting that low private first class who's in the middle of combat, right, is somehow thinking about what's going to get the other side to come to the negotiating table. I don't mean that. I think this notion of right intention is scalar, right? I do mean that once we get high enough up the chain of command, right? But here's what I do mean, even on the part of the lowliest soldier, I think there's a version of right intention that needs to exist where if there is a white flag waved on the other side, there is a readiness to entertain this idea of that moment of surrender, which would be maybe a micro moment of exhibiting right intention, right? That the real purpose or end goal is simply the cessation of fighting for the sake of some justice or a just peace, not the elimination of all.
All right, awesome. So next in the queue, I have Pierce. Pierce, take it away.
Yeah, so this partially fed off what you just responded to. But I'm really interested how you think you're going to be able to cultivate these right intentions with that private first class. I mean, they have a high school education at times or a little bit of college, GED equivalents, 17, 18, 19 years old. And so do they really have the framework to move away from that bureaucratic idea? Because standardized public education, it's about taking tests, it's about studying for the tests, and it's very systematic. And so I don't know if entertaining like McIntyre's virtue ethics ideas, unless we reconstruct that somehow, are going to be possible.
Right. I only smile because, you know, one big picture idea, well, absolutely, I'd love to restructure our education a little bit. but I'll back off of maybe that grand of of a solution to the problem that you rightly bring up. I would settle for a greater emphasis on this, both in initial entry training. And I think Steve has actually made this argument, if I remember right, in some other venues. And at least in my own research, right, I can tell you that I think it's all too low how much emphasis is placed on military ethics among lower enlisted as well as brand new officers, by the way. Here at West Point, we have actually a whole semester devoted to a course in philosophy and ethical reasoning. But if you go to, say, an ROTC counterpart cadet of one of these West Point cadets, right, they're getting in their ROTC program anyway, they're getting like 3 hours of a discussion about use ad bellum, use in bello, use post bellum. And so I guess my immediate response to your question would be a greater emphasis in the professional education and training that we give. Here too, I guess I want to keep it realistic on suggesting that it's tailored to the kinds of responsibilities that are going to be handed to the individual, right? I mean, I think a lowly private, I'm not asking to, or I wouldn't want to presume to have a full and rich knowledge of what a just and lasting peace entails in all the deep and very strategic manner, but on a micro level, here's what that means. I also think it could be better addressed in just the kind of culture that's fostered, which has its own impact, right, on every military member. And so this would actually go to the kind of critique that Steve and I have witnessed over both of our tenures, I think, in the military of trying to tamp down on some of the cadences that are all too dehumanizing of others. Some of the attitudes that relish killing all too much. I mean, I think even those moments can help work on embedding this kind of right intention that I'm talking about. I also, one last point on this, right? I do very much think my argument comes into tension with military recruiting efforts. I think there's a point where, your average recruiter or your advertising campaign, they're not going to want to say, hey, come and help take care of all humans, right? Come and help establish a just and lasting peace. For whatever reasons that we don't have time to get into, right? I mean, there's this kind of aura of fighting for the sake of fighting that I think needs to be addressed in a kind of wider cultural sense. But I do think there'd be some tensions maybe with recruiting efforts and trying to get the numbers that our organization wants to get.
All right. So thank you for that, Kevin. With apologies to Andrew, Meredith, and myself, who are all still in queue, I'm going to ask that we switch over to Blake's talk. And then my thought is, because I want to stay on time for folks who are jumping between the sessions. So my thought is, though, that we'll go ahead and have Blake speak to us and then do a specific Q&A. And then we can maybe reopen, right, and come back to some of the questions folks had for Kevin. Maybe we can discuss some of the links between the two discussions for the remainder of the session. So that sounds good to everyone. That's what we're going to do. So I'm going to now hand it over to Blake Hereth, who will be speaking to us about health justice for unjust combatants. Without any further ado, Blake, the floor is yours.
Hi, Jen, thanks. And Kevin, thanks for the great talk. I have questions, but I want to think about them a little bit more. And then if it's okay, I might chat with you in the later Q&A or email you about them. It's just so interesting to me. So I also wanted to say two things about the paper real quick. One is that this paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Military Ethics. So if you have any devastating objections, don't tell me. I don't want to know. No, I'm just kidding. It's still in press, and so there's still time to make some tweaks. They have a really big backlog right now. And the second thing is, I guess less about the paper and less just about being here for the CPP, which is that the last time I presented at the CPP was October of 2016, and I had to present remotely because I just had surgery for cancer, and was about to start undergoing chemotherapy. And y'all were just very great and welcomed me and allowed me to present remotely. And so it's nice to be back and be healthy, you know, so even though it's remote and I wish I could see all of you face to face, it's really nice to be back. It feels celebratory and good in a nice way. Okay, so on to the paper, I guess. So, my paper really, I don't know how many of you have read this book or know of this book, Helen Froe's book, Defensive Killing. It is a masterpiece of, I mean, Helen is just one of my favorite people and maybe my favorite living philosopher. No offense to present company, but she's just really wonderful. And I got to, I mean, you can see I just have so many things marked up in this book. And a lot of what I'm gonna say in this presentation today is a critique of the kind of view that she defends with respect to healthcare justice for unjust combatants. Okay, so just a little bit by way of background. So Helen Froe, a lot of people write, they endorse this view called reductive individualism and or reductivism. And the basic view or basic outline of this view is that for every true principle of permissible warfare, there is also going to be some true morally equivalent principle of permissible defense to which the principle of warfare reduces, okay? So take any sort of true principle that applies to warfare, it's just a principle of self-defense writ large, okay? That's really all it is, according to Froe, according to Jeff McMahon, according to a bunch of others, okay? So I think that this clarifies the goalpost a little bit. If you're not a reductive individualist, all you need to find is one true principle of permissible warfare that, in virtue of its moral properties, lacks a moral equivalent, right, in self-defense, or doesn't reduce as easily, okay? So I'm not gonna say much more about like the nature of reductive individualism. I think that there are different sorts of accounts of what it really is, but I think what I'm saying about it is well in line with what Froe and McMahon and others want to say. So what I want to do is present a different critique of reductive individualism. It's not going to be the kind of critique that like David Rodin talks about when he talks about like a doctrine of retreat. He says, I think that there's a true principle of retreat in self-defense cases, but I don't think that that's true in the case of war, because that would be a manner of like appeasing aggressors. And there's no, and Froe says, well, I mean, there's just really nowhere for states to retreat to. So it's not that there's a different principle, it's just that it's inapplicable to states, right? So the treatment that I'm going to, or the principle that I'm going to defend comes very much from Article 12 of the Geneva Convention, which is, I just call it treatment. It says the treatment of, and I'll define some of these terms later, the treatment of deactivated unjust combatants, and perhaps in some case, reactivated unjust combatants by partisan or nonpartisan field medics is often, all things considered, morally obligatory, even if just combatants don't consent to their treatment, okay? So there's this big thing in Article 12 of the Geneva Convention, which I can just read really quickly, the part of it that's relevant. So members of the armed forces and other persons mentioned in the following article who are wounded or sick shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. They shall be treated humanely and cared for by the party to the conflict in whose power they may be, without any adverse distinction founded on sex, race, nationality, religion, political opinions, or other similar criteria. They shall not willfully be left without medical assistance and care, nor shall conditions exposing them to contagion or infection be created. Only urgent medical reasons will authorize priority in the order of treatment to be administered, okay? So what I want to suggest now is just, I want to just distinguish between these kind of things and show you a little bit about Helen Froe, how her account and how a lot of reductive individualists handle this sort of worry, because by no means is she the only one. Cecile Fabre has a view like this as well. So let's talk a little bit about Helen Froe's account, all right? So unjust combatants are those who fight for a morally unjust side of an armed conflict. They're contrasted with just combatants who fight for the morally just side or amorally just side of a conflict. And what I'm thinking is that when combatants are injured, they fall their prognoses fall into two general categories. So the first of which is that they're a reactivated combatant. So somebody is a reactivated combatant just in case if they were to receive medical treatment, they would resume the moral equivalent of their prior combatant status, okay? So lots of war injured combatants recover and resume their duties within hours, within weeks, months. In cases of long-term armed conflict, injured combatants sometimes resume their military duties after years. So Helen Froh has something to say about reactivated combatants, okay, in the context of self-defense. So she's a reductive individualist, right? So she's saying, oh, what should we think about this case of self-defense? So she gives this example, which she calls rescue. So in the case, attacker breaks into victim's house and kills victim's family. As he is trying to strangle victim, victim hits attacker over the head, rendering him unconscious. Victim calls the emergency services who dispatch both the police and an ambulance. The ambulance arrives first. Paramedic immediately starts trying to revive the attacker. Assume that victim correctly believes that if paramedic revives attacker, attacker will continue in his attempt to murder victim. Victim hastily tells paramedic this. And Helen Froh defends a sort of radical line that the prohibition on causing harm trumps the prohibition on allowing harm, which is actually like a sort of view that I'm behind. But then she takes it a bit further and she says, if I'm right that paramedic may not treat attacker because attacker will then try to kill victim, why is it absurd to think that the Red Cross may not treat unjust combatants who will then try to kill just combatants? So she actually goes quite strongly and says that, yeah, I don't really see any obvious principled reason why just combatants cannot kill members of the Red Cross who are attempting to revive unjust combatants. And I thought, oh, right. But I mean, if you're thinking about it as a reductive individualist, I think this is a kind of powerful thought. I mean, this is a sort of powerful idea. I take that as a reductio, right? A little bit. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in this paper. But I think I think Helen Froh is thinking this through like really well and really carefully and making a really good case. So one thing to note that she says is that I think it is permissible for the Red Cross to assist unjust combatants, but it is permissible if and only if the just combatants consent to their doing so. Okay, so she provides another example where their victim and attacker are both badly injured. Attacker's accomplices are guarding the entrance to victim's house, and they will let paramedic in only if she agrees to treat both victim and attacker. Okay, so victim, she says, has good reason to consent, and if he consents, he thereby consents to the threat that paramedic poses to him by treating attacker. But Froh says, I don't know what we should think about cases where you have multiple parties who are injured, okay, and only one of them consents, right, and the other one doesn't. And I think this is really relevant because in war, the most Froh can say is that, well, I think just combatants, they could rationally consent to the Red Cross's activities, but that's not the same as saying that they do in fact consent to those activities. So I think that on Froh's account, the consent of each and every at-risk just combatant is necessary for the permissibility of the Red Cross's treating reactivated unjust combatants, all right? And I think that that's just very unlikely to ever happen, right? If it did, it seems contingent, but I don't think that the view I'm defending that's described in the Geneva Convention is really just contingently true, right? I think that it's quite, or even if it is contingently true, I think that it's very often true. And Froh's view would allow it to be very rarely or never true. So now I want to talk a little bit about deactivated combatants and what Froh would say about them. So deactivated combatants are unlike reactivated combatants in that if they were to receive medical treatment, they would not resume the moral equivalent of their prior combatant status. So there are lots of ways to be a deactivated combatant. You could be dead, right? Then you wouldn't be resuming the moral equivalent, right, of what you were doing before. You could be permanently comatose. You could be military. You could be discharged. You could swap moral allegiances, okay? So deactivated combatants lose the moral equivalent of their prior combatant status in each of those cases, whether by losing their combatant status altogether or by enlisting in a morally just cause, okay? So I think that Fro's account, for reasons that I can't explain too much here, I think that her account actually entails a duty not to treat deactivated combatants either. And one of the reasons why is because, and I give a bunch of reasons in the longer version of the paper, but one of the main reasons why is because it places a disproportionate and unjust burden on just taxpayers of the just state, and the resources, the medical resources, the gauzes, right, all this kind of stuff that are used to treat the unjust combatants, that's fewer resources to treat the just combatants, and that puts them at greater risk. Okay, so I think that there are good reasons to extend her account to deactivated combatants as well. So on Fro's account, basically what I'm saying is not only does she say that it's wrong for the Red Cross to treat deactivated or reactivated combatants, but also deactivated combatants. And I think, okay, well, okay, if there's really a place to get off board, it's here. All right. All right. So I mentioned treatments before. So here's where I get to the part where I talk a little bit more about like what I'm hoping to contribute to the conversation. Okay, so it's a bit of a spiel, especially for those of you who are in the military. You're just kind of be nodding along, right? Oh yeah, of course. So warfare, while it is carried out by individuals, it's executed primarily at the behest of states. It's states who determine why a war is fought, where a war is fought, when a war is fought, and who fights the war. Policymakers and heads of states declare war and command their armed forces to wage it. So traditional war theorists have identified, right, these three central moral principles, right, or categories of principles for a war to be just: jus ad bellum, jus in bello, jus post bellum, so on. So while reductive individualists might haggle over the extent to which combatants are responsible for their state's actions, they agree that states are certainly responsible for their combatants' actions to some degree. So one plausibly true principle that reductive individualists can and should accept is that if somebody orders a combatant to kill a liable party, then that person should be reasonably confident that the combatant won't kill non-liable parties in the course of killing the liable party, right? So states are reasonably expected, even under a reductive individualist view, to prevent war crimes, okay? I think even Fro is fine saying things like that. Okay. So combatants who culpably kill non-liable persons in war are routinely disciplined, although regrettably not as much, as often as they should be, thinking of recent pardons. And there are analogous cases of action for individuals to pursue in individualist cases. So now I want us to consider a kind of reductive individualist case, a very kind of domestic case of self-defense that I'll just call shootout, all right? So Wyatt Earp's life is jeopardized as, I'm a big fan of Tombstone. So Wyatt Earp's life is jeopardized as Curly Bill and three cowboys confront him in the town square, but dressed as civilians, unadorned by their distinctive red sashes. Fortunately, Doc Holliday and Earp's brother Virgil are close to Wyatt in the saloon and would swiftly come to Wyatt's defense if they're called. However, Doc and Virgil don't recognize Curly Bill or the cowboys without their red sashes. Dozens of non-liable parties are scattered throughout the square, unaware of the impending fight. Wyatt lacks the time to wave them off. He must either sacrifice himself or call on Doc and Virgil to join him, knowing the latter option would result in untold casualties to non-liable folks. All right, so here's what I have to say in my analysis of this case. So Wyatt isn't liable to be killed by Curly Bill and three cowboys, but nor the dozens of non-liable civilians in the town square. Whereas Curly Bill and the cowboys aren't using the civilians as human shields or anything like that, and would kill maybe, let's say, far fewer than Doc and Virgil, maybe because of which way they're facing or whatever. They're indifferent to the deaths, but they shouldn't be, and nor should Wyatt. Reductive individualists like Fro are going to rightly claim, in this case, that Wyatt is not permitted to call Doc and Virgil into the fight, as there is a lesser evil obligation to refrain from killing more non-liable people than you save. All right, so now I want us to consider a case that's like that, structurally similar, but it's war. All right, so call this case crimes. General orders a battalion of 500 combatants into a local village to identify and capture enemy spies. Despite General's confidence in her troops, she knows a handful of non-liable civilians will inevitably be killed, some by accidental crossfire, others intentionally as war crimes. General's predictions are accurate. 3 non-liable civilians are killed accidentally, 2 intentionally and culpably. Okay, so assume that the 3 accidental killings were an unavoidable side effect of going in and identifying the spies. Further, assume that these accidental killings, while unjust, were nevertheless justified in preventing more non-liable deaths than were caused. So there's a lesser evil justification for these side effect harms. All right, what should we conclude about the 2 intentional killings of non-liable civilians? Well, the reductive individualists might say their deaths were unavoidable side effects of war, but for whom were they unavoidable? The murdering combatants are culpable, but wouldn't be if their killing wasn't reasonably avoidable. So their killing was reasonably avoidable since they're culpable. A second, more promising proposal is that these deaths were unavoidable side effects of the general's orders. Okay, a battalion of this size is necessary to scout a village of this size, securely capture enemy spies, and minimize non-liable civilian casualties. But it's the size of the battalion that makes war crimes unpreventable and so unavoidable for General. Nearly all of General's combatants will carry out their duties responsibly and with integrity, but inevitably some won't. And it's not reasonably feasible to ascertain who's whom beforehand, okay? Had General handpicked 4 or 5 of her most trusted, conscientious combatants to search the village, their mission would have failed, but no war crimes would have been committed. By contrast, had General picked 4 or 5 untrustworthy combatants, or was in a reasonable position to join their search of the village and oversee their behavior directly, but declined to do so, then General's orders would have been morally impermissible. So the war crimes weren't reasonably avoidable by virtue of the group size. And that means that there's a group-based justification for General ordering the battalion to search the village. So call this principle something like group risk, okay? And basically the idea is that the harms, the intentional harms were, while reasonably avoidable for the individuals, they were not reasonably avoidable for the group, okay? And so you might think the group is justified whether the individual, even though the particular individuals are not, all right? So what I think that this principle, which I'm just calling group risk, establishes is especially group-based permission to proceed with warfare. But because the risk is undertaken by the group, they acquire residual responsibilities, okay? And then I mentioned like there are a number of kind of compensatory and proactive responsibilities like vetting, enforcement, repair, okay? So now I'm gonna jump down a little bit and just say that, all right, so I'm gonna get here. All right, so a lot of civilians are killed in war, some unintentionally, some accidentally, some intentionally as war crimes, all right? That much seems very sadly clear. So the duty to repair, I think, grows stronger when the harms were, or they had a non-trivial risk of being imposed culpably or without justification. So consider a case, which I just call criminal, where General, who foresaw that some of her troops would commit war crimes, has identified the culprit. Corporal confesses his crime to General. He tortured 2 non-liable civilians, shooting a young mother in the leg and breaking her son's arm. Fortunately, neither mother nor son have died, but unfortunately, both are in critical condition. General is faced with deciding how to repair the unjust evils that Corporal has wrought. So I see I only have like about 30 seconds left, but the basic idea is that if you think that these are group unavoidable, okay, and so the group is justified, the group still acquires residual responsibilities to care for those who, while not reasonably avoidable, right, were harmed, they still, right, and this happens all the time, okay? Like even unjust combatants are harmed sometimes disproportionately. All right, and are tortured or killed or go untreated or are exposed to different sorts of illnesses and contagions and bioweapons, so on and so forth. And those sort of things are unjust. And if you're looking at it from the kind of general's point of view or the state's point of view, right, it's hard to know which one was harmed unjustly by this way or which one was justly. And I think this provides reason for the generals and the states or whatever, a group-based responsibility to just treat all of the combatants, right? And to treat them in a very similar sort of way. So I think ultimately this principle satisfies irreducibility, and I think it justifies treatment. Okay, that's it.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Blake. We'll do the applause thing. That was awesome. I have so many thoughts. Okay. So just as we did before with Kevin's talk, if you have a question for Blake, just type question into the chat so that you don't have to like frame your question written down, which can often be more difficult than sort of speaking it aloud. And I'll call on you and then you can unmute and ask Blake your question. So we'll see if folks get themselves going. All right, Pierce, jumping in at the get-go. Go for it.
Yeah, I've been excited about this conference for like a year since you hosted your one last year. So, but what I was really curious is, so you're using a lot of thought experiments, which is great, awesome. It's what we do in analytic philosophy all the time. But when we practically apply it to situations like maybe Vietnam is the one that's coming to my mind initially, is that distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, there's not really these clear, the Viet Cong weren't clearly identifiable. And they didn't have a muster roll. They didn't have, these are the people that are going to go out and wage war against the American occupation. Whether our war there was just or not, that's a different argument. But when you go in and this woman and her son are harmed, what is the difference in the scenario if these individuals are possibly, if we just don't know if they're Viet Cong or not? So, or later become Viet Cong because of that issue. So a lot of the times what went on in Vietnam was the American occupation would harm someone, it would anger them and their family, and then they would join the Viet Cong to fight back, which is an understandable human response. Should you provide aid to those individuals in a situation where they could possibly be enemy combatants in the near future? Because that would seem non-intuitive to the goal that you're trying to accomplish in that region, to establish negative peace. With more enemy combatants, there's going to be more human lives wasted over time.
Good, yeah, so I think the question, it actually sounds a little like a friendly question. I mean, in the sense that not only may you maybe be in a sort of, not only is our epistemic position such that it's really hard to identify which unjust combatants were harmed disproportionately, which ones were harmed proportionately, or out of necessity as opposed to, right, just trivially. I always think of that scene in Saving Private Ryan where there's the one corporal who, like, if you just boo enough, right, he runs away and won't shoot at you, right? And I think Corporal Upham or something like that, right? So I mean, maybe you could do that instead of killing him. But you're right to point out that there's this additional worry, which is not only can we not distinguish between different kinds of unjust combatants, that's sort of epistemically hard, but we also can't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Now, one of the reasons why I didn't bring this up in the paper is because I'm critiquing Froh, and Froh does not really give a crap about the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. She actually considers toward the end of the book, she says, you know, maybe it's morally permissible to bomb taxpayers. Right? Because by contributing to the unjust aims of the state, they thereby accrue moral responsibility, and you're liable not in proportion to how much you contribute to the size of your contribution, but you are liable to the size of the threat to which you contribute. So you can't just say, well, I only built this one part of the bomb, right? Or I only kicked this person one time. Collectively, we kicked him to death, of course, but I just put in a few kicks. Froh says, I don't really care. That's not how we should think about proportionality. So I think she's not so neatly following this, but I think those sort of epistemic issues that you raise, additional sorts of like the fog of war and confusion about this stuff, actually just bolsters the case for treatments. So yeah, I completely agree with you. And war is not a neat, tidy thing ever. We often see it presented that way as like, well, we've got the red team and the blue team, and they just, you shoot it. If you're blue, you shoot at the red. If you're red, you shoot at the blue. And it's really simple, right? How can you not know? And if you dress in the wrong color that day, that's your fault, right? But it's really, as you pointed out, not really that simple. So I think that's right.
All right, definitely. All right, so now we'll turn it over to Keith. Keith, go for it. Good morning.
Good morning. And Blake, thanks. And I'm just wondering, does your view depend at all on the independence thesis? Does the justice of the war itself at all affect how we should treat the combatants? Or are you, as traditional, completely assuming independence here?
Yeah, so are you wondering about like MEC, like moral equality of combatants kind of stuff? Yeah, so
And non-combatants.
Yeah, good. So I am not sympathetic to MEC, but so I sort of do kind of agree with reductive individualists of their critique of MEC. And one of the things that I say in the paper that I didn't have a chance to read, so I'm glad you brought this up, was just to say that there aren't a ton of defenses of treatment in the literature, of robust philosophical defenses. And when there are, they usually just come by way of assuming MEC. They just say like, well, the moral equality of combatants, and that means that not only do we get to shoot at one another, whichever side you're on or sides you're on, but we also have to help each other. And I say, well, I want to give an argument for this principle in the Geneva Convention that's independent of MEC to show that it has appeal, because I would think that people like Froh and McMahon, if they saw that my defense of treatment depended on MEC, they'd be like, well, MEC is false, so who cares? But this is a separate sort of argument that I would hope they could get behind, and might make it a little bit easier if you're a reductive individualist to say, maybe there are some collective principles. Doesn't mean you have to just jump back into the boat and be a traditional just war theorist, right? There's plenty of options between them. And I think I'm somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, I don't think that all the principles reduce to self-defense principles, but I do think some of them do. And I think that, and I'm inclined to think that MEC is false, but I tried to make it so that it didn't depend on that. But that's a great question. Thank you, Keith.
Okay. All right. If it's okay, I'm gonna jump in. I have a question. Cool. Thanks, Kevin. Okay. So Blake, you know me a little bit. Not a reductivist. Like not playing on the reductivist blue team. Myself. But I am thinking about this, right? And I like the idea of, right, of not just what you said in response to Keith, right, of not having to depend on moral equality of soldiers, because that's the ball game in some ways, right? But so then I want to ask about extending your argument, I think, to the question of POWs, right? And to the question of treatment of POWs, right? Which is something that gets explored a little bit in the war literature, right? And I think is related to what you're talking about, but not quite the same, right? But because there are sort of international law requirements for treatment of POWs, right? That include things like not only treatment for if they have injury or health issues, but also, sort of keeping them in places that won't cause them to freeze to death, right? Or die of malnutrition. And so I'm wondering, can your argument be extended here to back up some of those statutes as well?
I think the answer to that is yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I mentioned a bit in the longer version of the paper that I just I don't have time to read, so two things. One is that the Geneva Convention's language is pretty clear about we have to treat all injured combatants, irrespective of who has them. at the time. So if you're on the blue team and you end up with some injured red soldiers and they're, in your capital, right, because they have to be shipped back because that's where the hospitals are, you still have to treat them. And I draw a little bit on, so Shlomi Segal, who's a luck prioritarian about healthcare justice, he has this really great line he has this really great explanation for why he thinks states should treat or should provide free medical care to undocumented migrants. And he says, our duty is not just to those who are in our family, but who are in our home. And so he says our duty encompasses not just like who they are, but where they are. And I think that there's something really appealing about that, and just saying like, you're responsible for making sure that this is a just and fair space, right? Good space. So I draw a little bit on that and say like, I think that something like that is going to hold for POWs and other stuff. I mentioned some of this in a footnote and explore it a little bit. So yeah, very sympathetic to that. I want it to extend to that. Not just like right on the battlefield, right, as people are shooting one another, but afterwards as well.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're officially at time, right? So if you would like to hop out or like go take a break and not look at a computer screen, right? The next session starts at 9:30, or I'm sorry, 10:30. I'm on Mountain Standard Time, so in my brain, but Central Standard Time, 10:30, the next session starts. If you'd like to keep hanging out and keep discussing these things with Kevin and Blake, I'm happy to keep us going. So yeah, but I just wanted to flag. Let's see. Kevin, you had a question for Blake. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, and Blake, this might be an overly general question, but it's just one thing that I'm curious about is, do you draw on maybe in the other details of your paper, or do you dive into the literature on group intentions and group agency versus individual? I mean, gosh, it seems like all that stuff would speak to the notion of reductive individualism.
So I don't. I am familiar with that literature. So here's basically the big reason why I don't, because reductive individualists don't like it. I mean, and I know that sounds like really funny. This paper is trying to get them on my side and, like not leave people to die on the battlefield. And I want to use resources that they're okay. And they could say, yeah, I guess I think it's group unavoidable. And so, yeah, maybe there's something like a not strictly individual group justification for this. And that's all I need. But I think do you know Jeremy Davis, who was a postdoc at this point?
Yes, I've been thinking about him a couple times in your talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So good. I'm glad you know him.
Yeah. So Jeremy and I are friends, and we met at the Mancept workshop that Saba Bazargan Forward was holding on collectivism and the morality of war. And so we had a chance this is where I first presented that paper, and we had a chance to talk about a lot of this. But he and I also went to the Helen Froese thing in Australia when she did it. And it was just a small reading group of like her and like Suzanne Uniacke and Seth Lazar and some of these people. And so we had a really good conversation. And I remember Helen at one point having this conversation, and she said, I don't really even know what you mean by war. War is just a bunch of individual instances of self-defense, right? That are just happen to be kind of co-located. Like, I don't know what group intentions are. I don't even know what groups are, right? And so we had a discussion, and I remember thinking like, well, have you read like the Liston Pettit stuff on, and she's like, yeah, but it's all wrong. And so I thought, I'm not going to draw on that literature hardly at all, although you absolutely could. And I think that literature is way more plausible than Helen does, although I'm not super collectivist and group, right? But yeah, so I tried to use as little of that as I felt like I really needed to. While also kind of getting something sort of group-based in here? I think that's a great question.
Thanks a lot.
Not general at all.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And so my question goes to both of you. that has to do with how military chain of command has an effect on how moral responsibility gets distributed. Because, well, I know this is probably an old hat question too. Those of you who have been thinking about this for a long time, but it seems to me that when soldiers are following orders, they are in some way reduced as moral agents.
Yeah, Blake, please chime in. I'll give you my off-the-cuff reaction that you're prompting one conversation I was curious to have with a military lawyer one time, where tried to point out to me, the trivia question was, how often has the defense in a war crime trial, how often has the defense of, hey, I was following orders, been successful? And his point was 0. That when it comes to guilt or no guilt, it's never worked. Now it's definitely played into the mitigation of the punishment, perhaps, and that aspect of it. But as much as I do get concerned about reducing the moral agency or attempting to reduce the moral agency of soldiers too much, there is that kind of legal backstop, if you will, that seems to at least recognize some minimal level of it always remains. But yeah, honestly, my earlier question was a bit motivated by this too, right? The work on collectivism and group agencies, all this stuff, it needs to be, I think, more brought into military ethics to precisely address what you're talking about. What kind of moral responsibility is there across the hierarchy versus maybe what is portrayed maybe by us in uniform.
Yeah, now, am I correct
and those in charge
in thinking that the standard moral, the standard rule in military ethics is that a soldier is obligated to refuse an illegal order, but not ethically required to refuse an oral order that the soldier deems to be immoral? That distinction is.
I actually think, and Steve, chime in with this, right? If you want to help, but it's both illegal and also unethical. Both of those judgments are expected. Go ahead, Steve.
I agree that is an expectation that we talk about all the time, that we should disobey immoral orders, but it's not codified in any of the law that we should. The military doesn't want to get into the weeds of arbitrating what's moral and immoral. So the only thing we're required to do is to disobey illegal orders, and you disobey immoral orders at your own peril.
All right, so I'm gonna jump in here, and I want to turn it over to Andrew to make sure he has a chance. He's been waiting so patiently. So Andrew, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Nice to see you all, and enjoyed very much the conversation. I'm really glad, Kevin and Steve, that you're working on this within the military, and I think it's a really, really important activity to be engaged in. So thank you for doing that. I have no military background, but when we're talking about morality and ethics and soldiers, I like what Pierce said before about we're talking about 17, 18-year-old kids with not great education often. And one of the things that we have assumed about morality is that it's a rational thing, right? So we're talking, in most of the discussion, it's about thinking about the right kind of options to take. But there's that other strand of ethics that comes through Hume and Smith and the ethics of care that says ethics is not so much about thinking rationally about choices, but it's a much more passionate, visceral thing that happens. So for Smith, you see a baby, and of course you're drawn towards the baby in a protective way, right? And that's what the ethicists of care say. Now, if you flip that round, so you're not thinking about benevolence and fellow feeling, those kind of things, but you're a young soldier in a battlefield, you're not thinking rationally about which is the right choice. You're much more responding passionately and viscerally to a situation. So I'm not quite sure what the question is in there, other than saying maybe that's closer to the reality for soldiers. It might not be for generals and strategists, but for ordinary soldiers, it might be that.
No, Andrew, I think your intuition, your concern, right, is precisely part of what's motivated me to try to work on this stuff. Is that, I don't know, in my view, we've gone overly rule-based, at least within the military context. I'll leave it up to others to decide whether this is the case everywhere else. Even though my spouse, the educator, the more I hear from her, the more I'm convinced that education too has gone way too rules and data-based at the expense of fostering maybe all sorts of other things that I want to couch out as character. And so with soldiers, I think too, they face situations that require not just good reflection when you've got the ability to do that, but good visceral reactions, right? And it's precisely that makes me want to be an advocate for a notion of right intention as something that's maintained as a disposition, right? Not just as a just a theoretical principle that we entertain as we have time, or we entertain when we're in the back room making plans. I'm just not convinced real moral life is this compartmentalized either, right? Where it's either thinking or feeling. I think they interact in all sorts of complex ways, and the best thing to be aiming for is how they help each other out, right? I think the planner that's in the basement planning, some large year-long campaign actually needs to be motivated by certain visceral feelings and stuff too, and not just thinking straight about what laws require. It's easier to just settle on the law thinking, but I'm not convinced it's better. I think there's a lot of money wasted on people who are doing a bunch of thinking and way too little fellow feeling, way too little examination of the policies and the campaigns in light of maybe certain kind of character-minded virtues. So we can talk some other time maybe about this whole effort I'm making towards the relevance of empathy in soldiering, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. I love it. Blake, do you want to jump in and have the last word?
Yeah, Andy, the only thing I wanted to say is that at least in the debate over reductive individualism, collectivism, or whatever, I know Jeff McMahon talks a lot about non-culpable ignorance and youth and stuff like that as a potentially excusing condition for unjust combatants. But notably, he thinks that it is permissible to defensively kill, even fully excused unjust combatants. So there's this big literature that Jen knows a lot about child soldiers and stuff like that. And it's just really upsetting to see reductive individualists really go the wrong way there. I think that's a separate criticism, but I'm very sympathetic to that. I didn't raise it in this paper, but I completely agree with you. That's really important.
Oh man, now I just want to talk about how the reductivists are wrong about these kinds of things. But it's not my session. But this was such a wonderfully engaging session. So please join me in thanking our presenters again. I found this such a nice way to start a Friday, right? So wonderful. So thank you both so much. I have so many questions for both